This meeting is being recorded.
Andre, so good to see you, man. We've been friends for, I guess, what, a decade, something like that. What do you think?
Coming up on it, yes. I'd have to track it back. Feels like even longer anyway.
Hmm.
However we measure time, right?
Yeah, it must have been longer because now when I think back, it has to be before 2009 that you came to visit for the first time.
It wouldn't be that far
Has to
back,
be.
but
Yeah.
time is a very tricky bit, right? Given our many conversations on the topic, so how it feels is definitely very very different in terms of how time has flown. We've had that in a few of our experiences as well. So
Yes, yes, but in my case, there's which I mean, I'm not going to say specifically what it is, but
mm,
there's an arbiter that I can use to determine, and one of them is that I was outside with you, right? Which wasn't always possible.
yeah, we went for some nice walks.
Yeah, so that has to be pre 2009. There's no
Hmm.
other way around it. Yeah.
And here we are again,
Yeah.
or here we are still, however that's said
Yeah, so I'm
properly.
here in San Francisco. Whereabouts are you?
Well, I'm here in Bucharest for now, so 10 hours away from you. We're pretty much splitting the globe.
Hmm. And is that place that you're in, is it your home? Is it a place you rent? How long have you been there?
Well, it's the place. Home is an interesting topic for me. It's the place that used to be home. It's where I was born and raised till I was 20 when I left for California. It belongs to me right now. It used to belong to my parents. I no longer really call it home. I mean, we set up home in it, as it were, but home has become a much different notion and with a different felt sense to it. So we kind of half jokingly, half seriously refer to it more as base camp than home base. So it is base camp for now, where we usually kind of fold up after, like this year, being away here and there in a number of different locations, and then pulling inwards for the winter season for a period of hibernation and incubation that we usually try to do in a sort of at-home retreat. So for that, it is home and base camp and refuge and sanctuary and retreat space.
So this is the place in which you were raised? That's
Yeah,
pretty amazing, man. I mean,
some
in terms,
some old iteration of me, that is. I can hardly identify with that. This has been several characters back, so looking back over it, there's no emotional or energetic threads felt to it. It just feels like someone informing me of some previous iteration, and there's no sense of nostalgia or funness or things popping up whatsoever. But locationally, geographically, and everything else, that's the place.
that's very interesting, everything you said there. I think your detachment from it points, I mean, I don't know exactly what it points to, but in the way that I hear it and what I make of it is that you've sort of cleansed out your interiority of the historical iterations of who you are so that those attachments just aren't there.
Aptly put, well spotted, and aptly put. It's actually been a deliberate process that, if I were to trace its earliest seeds, not even root, this was prior to root, is what in the tradition that Castaneda was purporting to transmit, they used to refer to as recapitulation, which is a process of methodically revisiting one's life frame and essentially extracting by way of presence and reinserting presence into the episodes, extracting the energy that was still stuck in any episodes that might bring up an emotional zing, let's say, of any kind, of any kind.
Mhm.
So essentially, like sucking the energy back into the present, and then in conjunction with that, a process of also dating back to them as a notion, erasing personal history. Went through several episodes of that. The name change is part of that aspect. Some layers of sitting and deleting all of my photos up to a certain point. That was a few years ago. So there've been many such layers of erasure and letting go, erasure and letting go, and that too is part of what allows me to be in this place. And essentially, it's like a familiar new place, as it were.
Wow. Yeah, so I first encountered Castaneda in probably around 90, I guess would be 8. Had heard of him, had no exposure to those traditions. Uh, my girlfriend's roommate had a few of his books sitting on a shelf, and I just picked up the first one, started reading it, and was immediately deeply impressed. There's something very strange about that book. And as somebody who, like you, we're both bibliophiles, to put it mildly, I mean,
To put it
yeah, I'm
mildly.
going to be asking you some questions about that. But yeah,
Uh-huh.
this thing blew me out of the water. I became very immediately fascinated with it. I eventually did some experiments with recapitulation. Um, One thing that's clear to me, however, which is sort of weird, is that when I was 17 and living in Stockton, we received in the mail a flyer from the local Scientology branch. And they
Okay.
have what they call a personality test, which is like a series of about, I don't know, 80 questions, just check boxes, right? And if you fill it in, they offer you this thing which they call a free communications course. And so I was introduced to Scientology through that. I went in for the communications course. A lot of what that was learning how to sit with someone right in your face, attempting to get a reaction out of you and just being like dead, right? Non-reactive, no matter what they did. But they
Okay.
taught us about this thing that they call auditing, which uses a device they call an e-meter, which is essentially two metal probes that you hold in your hands, wired to a device with a sort of readout on it,
Mm-hmm.
and they say different words or bring up names. You sort of give them the the information they might need to figure out what might trigger you. And the idea of being clear in Scientology is similar to the idea of having fully recapitulated your history and also erased your personal history. Very similar concepts, which I find interesting. I don't know if you were aware of any of that. Have you had any exposure to Scientology at all?
No, that's news to
Hmm.
me. Sounds very interesting, though. And I was almost curious, like, oh, okay, I'd like to get my hands on those, literally speaking. See what that's like.
Right.
See what that brings
Yeah,
up.
I'm pretty sure you could get an e-meter. I don't think, I'm pretty sure there's plans for them you can buy. Of course, Scientology is a straight up cult, but I mean, I would argue that, well, no, I wouldn't argue. I would suggest that uh, the Castanedan tradition was also pretty culty, particularly the inner circle with the girls, uh, Kylie and Taisha and um, the Blue Scout, whose bones were found at Panamint Dunes shortly after Castaneda passed away. All the women disappeared. Nobody knows where they are. We don't know if they're alive or dead. At least one of them is dead. Um, of course, they had already undergone a kind of similar process, right, of complete obliteration of personality. I actually have a letter from Taisha somewhere. I wrote to her, and she wrote me back. She didn't say much. She gave me some suggestions about what I might do to prepare
Mhm.
for studying path. And mostly it was just like be impeccable, which is an interesting idea because I think it's the language is relatively confused, and also to study martial arts, particularly Tai Chi or Kung Fu, which I ended up, pursuing Tai Chi.
Okay.
But yeah, I haven't done anything similar to what you're talking about. I've experimented with recapitulation. I also have a couple of friends who study existing shamanic traditions. One of them belongs to a group called the Maker Shamans, and they are hugely, they teach recapitulation. They are a tradition that traces its roots back to Europe in the sort of the pre-witch hunt stuff. And they are not in any way associated with Castaneda. But the idea of recapitulation that they teach is essentially the same thing, some other techniques. I'm curious what led you, um, how did you discover this particular practice and what inspired you to pursue it?
Well, it's not a linear answer I would give. Castaneda was one of the early seeds in my early years when I was a teen that set me, um, that got me going, that set me on not on the path as much as seeking a path. Um, Found it shortly after, actually, after not too long, joining a fourth way group. That is actually how I ended up in California in the end, and part of a cult in my own turn, would served me well for a good decade of very, very solid practice. But initially, thinking back now that I was talking to you, I think it was essentially a handful of different flavors in my teen years that kind of accreted on a very eclectic magnetic center, as Gurdjieff would call it, that started orienting my compass needle, as it were. And it was Taoism and yoga and Osho and Castaneda, essentially. Those were the main pillars. Um, there were also martial arts, but they were some of the Hindu practices and the Upanishads, but they all kind of affiliated to one or the other of these being sufficiently distinct. Now, I didn't go through Castaneda in depth. Actually, I concentrated mostly on his dream work back in the day, and was fascinated with lucid dreaming, which I managed to achieve then, and then lost the capacity for many years afterwards. And the recapitulation, essentially, I remembered about the process much later on, essentially as I was fully embarked on it and doing it without having the nomenclature or the concept, and it just popped back up. It's, hey, by the way, we know this already, or that's what the Toltecs called recapitulation in his tradition. So I can't even say that I studied it as much as the concept came back at the time in my life when I was deeply involved with this combined process of recapitulation and erasing of personal history. It was during a time of a solitary, silent retreat that I took in a faraway land for months, just alone and unplugged and with everything turned off and basically hard to reach unless you came knocking on my door. And this was part of that process. It started earlier with the ramp, and it had a tail afterwards as well, and a mopping up part, if I can call it this way. And it's part of a larger process, I would say, of dissolution, or at least the allowing of a disintegration of a sense of self. I think initially it was a lot more voluntary and deliberate, and hammering at it and going at it a number of different ways in accordance with the practices and traditions I had trained and exerted myself in. And at some point, it just snowballed into something that it's had its own momentum. So my job remained to just, stay breathing, keep my head above the water, as the process just hurled itself at breakneck speed, almost literally, so to speak, and just allow it to take place. So that's where it fit in. So it was less of a Castaneda thing as much as a throwback, and realizing that, okay, that's what they meant by it, but discovering it in motion as something was happening and giving it a name from an already familiar index, if I can put it this way.
Beautiful. That's all very clear. What were your original motivations in pursuing these skills, these paths, and how did they transform over time?
Oh, right. That is 20 different questions in one to answer there. Well, it's on one level, it's let's say simple but not easy to answer. The simple part is that the original motivation, which remains alive all throughout, just changed in comprehension, was waking up, was a drive to wake up, stemming from a deep unease, a sort of restlessness and unease, at the nagging feeling that what I'm actually perceiving and interacting with, the world around me, my inner scape, outer scape, are not what they seem. And in the more, let's say, extreme form or extreme states in terms of how it's registered, even I could use the word fake. That I'm looking at a fake scenario, a fake screenplay, a fake character. It was only much later on that I ran across this movie that I'm sure you know, called The Truman Show, with Jim Carrey. And it's a bit like that, on a more, let's say, like a course level, still the same kind of reality. But otherwise, earlier on, it was more an intuitive sense and a nagging sense of the experience of Neo in the Matrix, of feeling like this is not it, this is really not it, and like feeling that I'm under a deep spell, a sort of trance. Gurdjieff called it a sort of auto hypnosis that we're under, and living in sleep, and then just doing my damnedest that I could to snap out of it, to wake up from it, not even really knowing what that means, just knowing that I can't have this continue, essentially. Like this is not it. So it was more of a process of purging the this is not it than the pursuit of a this is it. Like, hell, what would I know? What could I know in that regards? But it was more a matter of no, not this. This is not it. This is still not it. And how it evolved over time, it just became a lot more, I guess, systematic, from being rather haphazard and crapshoot and hit and miss and eclectic and disorganized and unstructured and undisciplined, to being very methodical. And then later on, I could even use the word ruthless, quite terminatory to some extent. And that's been terminal to a number of relations in my life and to many different aspects of my life in several different waves. And then in time, it became, after some of these highest waves, a bit more gentle as a process, not as driven, not as militaristic, not as militant, not as activistic as it was, not as rushed, not as forced, not as pushed, a bit more Taoist, if I can use this as an epithet for it, but continuing all the same. And the methodologies changed, and I got exposed to more and more people and traditions that have been doing these things for far longer and with much higher capacity and competence than I had exposure to.
Wow.
Up to those points.
So this is very sensible to me, everything you share here. I recall in the Castaneda books, some scenes, one in particular stands out, and my memory of it is probably blurry, but Carlos is at some kind of a farm with Don Juan and one of his friends. And he's having some kind of trouble with a car. And Don Juan and his friends are laughing a lot. They think this is hilarious. And he's trying to get the car to run properly or something like this. And he gets stuck on a dirt road, and Don Juan and his friend are just losing their shit. They're just like belly laughing and crying. And Carlos gets very angry at one point and says, you know what? Why is this funny? I'm trying to get this car to work. And Don Juan sort of, he still can barely talk. He's laughing so hard. And he says, Carlos, your car is not here. This entire time you have been interacting with your hat. There's no car. And, you know, this is the kind of a sense of the problem and how deeply, profoundly weird and confusing it is, because we are trained and we learn to take our delusion of our perception and the world as concrete and factual and true, right?
Yeah.
And I recently was thinking about this. I mean, there's so much I want to explore here with you about this, but I was recently thinking about this, and I have similar concerns, but I've been much less effective and much less disciplined than you. Vastly less, I'm sure. But I have similar concerns and interests and such, though I'm mostly asleep, to be honest. I mean, I wake up in certain ways when I'm with someone who's sharp, but most of the time I'm a zombie just like everybody else, I think. But one of the mistakes I think we make is, and we're trained to make it, is that this thing here, so bottle of rubbing alcohol, it's very solid, it's very reliable to my senses. It's quite continuous in time. It's not likely to be moved around by itself. Like if I set it down, somewhere, it's going to probably be there when I come back. Or, those objects over there, that door, this computer, these things, they have a kind of reliable continuity in time and form. And I think that there's you could call them layers or registers of existence. And I think one of the mistakes we make is we transfer the expectation of continuity of form, function, position, stability over time. We transfer that from the layer in which it's relatively reliable to all other things. So we just think that all things are like this, including me and her and them and all the things we think about. We transfer this, that creates a huge array of mirrored illusions that are wrong. That one move. It's a fundamental error.
Right. That extrapolation that you're talking about, which moves from what is essentially, as you're holding up the bottle, it's an assembly of sensory perceptions. Really, there are a number of senses involved that decode that in a certain way, and everything else on top of that is invented. is our way of is second hand, you know, pun not intended. You're holding that in your hands, like no other second hand involved. The second hand is the mind, but everything from there on is second hand. What you don't have, you know, what's not in your hand. How we create the notion of bottle and the notion of alcohol, and associate that with certain information stored in our registers, perhaps memories, the color white, where the bottle was, where it came from, how much it cost, a lot of additional layers. Whereas if you were to hand the same bottle to a young child or newborn, someone coming from a culture that has no rapport like we do with the objects, or at least those objects that are so familiar to us, and have no idea what that is and what to do with it and how to treat it. A senile elderly person or things like that, or someone who's in a trance, they would not have the same rapport with that object. So the fact that we solidify, we consolidate some of these perceptions into concepts that then we give names that are then attached to words that are furthermore sometimes written down in symbols. We essentially function across 4 or 5 different layers of approximation, of denomination are experienced, instead of being in our direct experience, where bottles come and go, and so do dream catchers and mandalas and doors and things hanging on them, and the colors you're wearing, and none of it really has names, and especially not ourselves. And even the notion of self has emerged like a sort of personality equivalent on a human level of a bottle that we take with the same kind of consistency and solidity out of that process of extrapolation that you were talking about, as that bottle of rubbing alcohol. And to dismantle this this edifice is hella tricky, because everything around us pulls us back into reestablishing these patterns of perceiving, of communicating what we're perceiving, of relating to our experience, one another, the world, through these frames. So it's almost schizophrenic to actually be awake behind all of these, you know, layers of deception, while at the same time playing the game and naming names and talking talk and using rubbing alcohol without getting anybody harmed.
Okay, so I'm actually having an unusual experience at the moment, and it could have to do with the so there's different ways to talk about it. I sometimes use the phrase the third mind to indicate the space we forge together that is neither me nor you, right? And that comes together according to why we are together and how. But I'm having the experience of a light degree, but a present one, of relief of my sleep, so that I'm starting to not know what the things are around me. I can feel that I don't know what they are. And
That's great.
this is very uncommon for me. It could also have to do with something of the power of your focused awareness and attention, and our agreement, you know, to come together and look and see and so forth. But yeah, it's really interesting because I know a large number of, I am aware of many people, and I know a few who have been very interested in the idea of lucid dreaming. And I've learned quite a bit of unusual things about that I don't think are commonly understood by the people who practice it, but I'm not sure, because, you know, we may make projections about what the world or other people are like, or what they know or don't know. But ordinarily for most of us, and I'll certainly for me, the actual slice of the world with which I have any intimacy is extremely thin, right? The slice with which I have some actual direct contact, if I'm thinking about what other people are doing, I'm just making shit up. I have no contact with other people, right? I'm going by my evaluation of the field of information that I receive from outside and the media and so forth. And by the way, this is another way of just going right the fuck to sleep. I mean, completely fucking gone, right? We You
Right.
think that like what you're reading in the news and blah blah blah, or whatever the fucking media you're exposed to is, TikTok, who knows what, right? That's giving you some perspective of what the world is or what's going on or what other people think or what they're doing or any of that. It's not entirely untrue, but the degree and the way in which it's true are nothing like the degree and the way in which it tends to affect our perspective and sort of put us to sleep. But
Yes. Yes.
so one of the things that I would say is that in dreaming, which let me try to be clear about a few things very briefly without going into a lecture. Um, the dreaming mind's way of being an experience, if I can use this phrase, the dreaming mind, dreaming aspect, is very different from what we experience while we're awake. And we're not necessarily inclined to understand that because we interpret our memories of dreaming with our waking mind, which in a way would
Yeah.
be like asking a man about the experience of having a uterus. Right. Yeah, go ahead. Ask the guy. Sure. Yeah. So interpreting our dreaming experience with our waking mind is going to wrong foot us. And what I think would be actually a lot more fascinating, it would be that if we could somehow inquire of our dreaming mind about what it makes of that stuff that happens over here in the waking world, that would be trippy, right? And I think the dreaming mind is actually very concerned and curious about what happens post-apocalypse, because the dreaming mind dies every morning. The whole world of the dream, it just comes to a fucking end, right? And the dreaming mind is aware that there's something on the other side of that apocalypse. And I would suggest that certain features of it survive that apocalypse, but they are profoundly inhibited most of the time during our waking experience. And one of the things that was happening a few moments ago when I was starting to lose my grip on what stuff is that I was starting to have more like the sense of dreaming. I'll try and say a few other things briefly and then get back to some interesting questions, and feel free to ask any of your own. So lucidity, first of all, there's a whole continuum of modes of dreaming. It's not just one thing. Oh, you're dreaming or you're not. You can think of it in that simple terms. It's not going to help you much. There's a whole continuum of modes, all different kinds. So simple example would be if you happen to be dreaming that you are in the room you are sleeping in at that moment while you are dreaming, it's not the same thing as a regular dream, right? If you're having a dream,
Right.
say again.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Different class.
Yeah. If you're messing about with light fixtures in the dream, not the same thing as a regular dream. Trying to turn on a light or something like that, it's not a regular situation in the dream. As if there are regular situations, but so there's a whole bunch of different modes of dreaming and forms of dreaming that I think is important to understand, so we don't just think like you're either dreaming or you're not, which is, true, but sort of trivial. And then there's a variety of degrees of lucidity, clearly. And if you're dreaming that you're in the room that you're sleeping in, you're probably on the verge of light lucidity. And if you're messing around with light fixtures, generally, there might be some exceptions where this isn't true. You're also you're entering the liminal space between the two minds, if there are two, right? If there's a dreaming mind and a waking mind, for the sake of convenience, use simple language.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're starting to enter that liminal space. And that liminal space is where there's sort of a three-way branch, right? You either kind of return to dreaming, and often the dream will backfill because you'll have some kind of a question. A sort of a question will arise, like why? Well, I'm turning the light switch on, the light's not going on. What's happening? So I go in an actual situation I experienced. I go and get a flashlight, turn that on, doesn't go on. I'm like, okay, the light switch not being on, that could be the electricity out. But the flashlight not working, that can't be the electricity out. So you have some kind of a question about the dream situation. And this is the weird thing about dreaming. um, Explicit features of identity or situation or language. These are anathema to dreaming. These end the
Right.
right. Um, and so anyway, you have this branch. A lot of the time, what will happen is the dream will backfill. It'll give you a sort of plausible explanation for what's going on, so you can just keep dreaming. Or
Yeah, yeah. They have a technical term in dreaming. They refer to that as confabulation.
yes, perfect.
You know,
Great. I love it.
the dream makes up the story as to, well, of course. I mean, the lights have never worked. I mean, what were you expecting?
Right.
Where did you even get this idea in the first place? You're expecting stuff to come out of these objects here. That doesn't happen, man.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Why
yeah.
were you thinking this? Yeah, or even yesterday was your birthday and you blew the candles out and they're still out.
See?
Right? Yeah,
Yeah.
you could so the dream mind is great at this confabulation or backfilling. And what I would argue is that actually what the waking mind is doing all the time that results in our delusional sleep is the same kind of thing, but very explicitly, right? Of course, that cup was there on the table yesterday, right? Darren was born in 1960X on day X of month Y, right? And he's lived every day ever since then, right? This is his face. These are his clothes.
Yeah.
Of course, right? Not only that,
It takes these things as being like self-evident and set in stone, and then we no longer question our experience, our perception, and so on, because of course, yeah, this is my cup and it's the desk, and this is me, and these are my fake eyebrows, and I've like doing this since I know myself. Brings up some strange Black Mirror episodes now that we're talking about it, where if you ask yourself this kind of question, you start wandering into that territory of like, where was I prior to this episode, and can I be really so sure? This was one of my triggers back in the day in terms of reality checks within dreams, so-called reality checks. It's kind of a funny name, right? To use it like that, it's almost presumptuous to put it like that, because the dream, you see, doesn't have a reality. We're doing reality checks in dreams as if this is the reality, so we're just doing the testing as per this mode of perception in the dream to validate it. But anyway, I'll use that phrase so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. But it was to backtrack and see if I can remember where this all started. Like, where was I here? Okay, I was in the hallway before coming in here. Okay, and prior to the hallway was the entrance to this building, and prior to that, what do you mean prior to that? Huh? And then all of a sudden, that can flip a switch there, and it cuts. It's wait a minute. All right, I might be dreaming. Sometimes it's the light switch. This was one of the technical advices for checking, for reality checking,
Mhm.
was to flip a light switch. Yes, this was one of the common ones. Another one was to jump. And this has never really worked for me. The confabulation was too strong on this one, for example. But there were a few others that worked, and this backtracking was one of them. To see if I can remember all the way back.
Okay, we're into some heady stuff that I think is amazing and I'm loving it. So one of the things I'll mention, this guy Sergio Magone, he I saw an interview with him on YouTube accidentally. I just stumbled into it. I think I was probably blundering around looking for some Castaneda and stuff one evening, and I came across this interview with an older Jewish guy interviewing this fairly, like 30 something Hispanic man. And the guy was talking about Toltec practices and stuff. And he talked about his training in Mexico City and around there, and the use of mirrors to literally erase, to use a mirror and erase while you're awake, erase you so that when you look in the mirror, you do not see yourself. There's nothing there. And one of the things that he spoke of was if you should find yourself in a situation where you're partially lucid and you have some volition in the dreaming, um, one of the best things you can do, one of the most powerful things you can do, is to simply turn your perspective around so that instead of looking out from your body into the world, you're looking into your body from it. And he would say,
Okay.
he said, if you do this, you will find there's nothing there. Then you will have liberty. Then you'll be free. And weirdly, totally unexpectedly, about some few nights later, I fall asleep and boom, I find myself on the roof of my house. Night sky is there, and I realize like dreaming. And I try to turn my perspective around and I can't. So I do the thing he said to do if you can, which is just to look at your hands. And one of the things I remember is that my hands were a little bit blurry, but the thumbs were on the inside. And the moment that I saw that in my hands, I just became flying. It's not like Darren was flying like Superman. Darren was gone. I was just the experience of flight. And then, I went off and had some adventures, which I won't here elucidate because they're somewhat explicit. And then I went somewhere else and did something very sort of Darren-esque, which is commit to the protection of someone. And this happened twice, and the same thing happened both times. Flight, some animal stuff happening, and then I go and say, like, I'm going to protect this person that I find. And about, I don't know, some period of time later, perhaps a month or two, I was on a call with a close friend from Britain, and she said, "Oh, my friend Alan's calling. Do you mind if we just include him in the call?" It's like, "Yeah, sure, let's do it." So we're talking, and I suddenly realize this is the guy who was interviewing Sergio Magone. Her friend is that guy who's interviewing him, which I find very weird. So I tell him what happened, the story and everything. I've done some interviews with him. He's an interesting cat. He's in his 70s now, and he's interviewed probably 3,000 people in the shamanism, paranormal, UFO, abductees. He knows Whitley Strieber, and he sort of knows everybody. A very interesting cat. In any case, my point was, before I lose it, because I'm telling personal history stories, right? I've become deluded while we're here talking about trying to wake up. It strikes me that lucidity involves the gentle intrusion of certain faculties of waking consciousness into the dreaming context, right? Which I can think of as like a sort of manifold of bubbles, if you will. And so if something comes in sort of gently and intrudes gently, it doesn't cause the bubbles to collapse, right? They can keep bubbling, right? They keep breathing and bubbling. But if it comes in sort of at a more acute angle, it tends to burst that, right? So you wake up.
Yeah.
And there's a whole bunch of stuff here I could blather on about that is fascinating to me, but I won't, about synchronization between metabolic rhythms, circadian rhythms, and oniric rhythms, which are our dreaming rhythms. And these rhythms are very complex. And there are certain modes of desynchronization that are likely to result in lucidity, and other modes that result in the collapse of the manifold when you wake up. and other modes that sort of go toward lucidity, but then dissolve right back into more or less regular dreaming, if there even is such a thing as regular dreaming. But one of the things I find fascinating is that none of the people, I haven't heard a single person really, who, and I'm sure there are some, who are interested in lucid dreaming, wonder about its opposite. What would
Opposite meaning taking dreaming into what we call the waking state, not remaining in the dream territory, right?
Yeah, right. Like the subtle and the gentle intrusion of the dreaming intelligences or forms of awareness or consciousness in the waking state without collapsing it into pure dreaming, necessarily. I was talking recently with Sarah Janes. I have an interview I did with her about a week ago. That's so amazing. She is someone who uh, studies and teaches dreaming techniques from ancient Greece and does dream incubation with groups and stuff like this. And what a
Okay.
brilliant soul she is. I just want to sing her praises for a moment. Uh, and she was talking about succeeding at something like this. Um, Succeeding at dreaming while awake without the use, for example, of intoxicants and so on. And how it became, see, this is what I really wonder. What would our dreaming experience, what would our dreaming senses and faculties make of a world that doesn't transform when you look at it more closely? Because I think the dreaming, whatever's going on with form and identity in dreaming and also with time and relationship, it's very different from what's going on over here usually, it seems.
Yeah.
What do you make of all these things? I ask a question, share whatever's on your mind. I'd love to hear.
Well, the way you posited the perspective. So first off, in terms of references, loved what you said about Sarah Jane, if that's her name. It reminded me of something I've been reading recently about the process you're referencing, which I am not knowledgeable of. This is just things that I've come across from Peter Kingsley's books, who talks about the process of incubation used by the pre-Socratics. We call them pre-Socratics, and like before Christ era sort of thing. But they're the roots of Western civilization, and the oracular tradition, and the priests of Apollo, and the incubatory processes that were central to their healing traditions, and the even farther roots dating back through Pythagoras, and the eastern roots from Mongolia and Central Asia, and the shamanic tradition, which we can actually appropriately call shamanic because it came from the area that shamanism is properly called shamanism. We're talking Central Asia and Siberia and that part northeast Eastern Asia. And in a way, the word that comes to mind of what you're describing, which is a word that we invented, I think it's not an extraordinary thing for someone operating within those cultural mind frames, is trance, is shamanic trance. The equivalent of what you're describing as the intrusion, the infiltration, the release maybe of the dreaming mind into our so-called waking state would be the shamanic trance. It's in one of the books I'm reading right now. You might know the author. His name is Arnold Mindell. He draws heavily from the traditions pointing to Castaneda and shamanic traditions as well, and process work and group process work. And he speaks about this notion of dreaming body and operating and relating to our experience, our perception with the dreaming body, not just the rational mind. And this dreaming body, and he used the word body because it actually uses the body a lot. It uses the same perceptual faculties that otherwise the analytical mind is operating from as well. but in different ways. And I think what happens when you're describing, what would the dreaming mind make of this more fixed reality, is that this is one of the things that changes as this intrusion is allowed to take place. And it's the same as the reality of an oracle being in their trance. This reality is no longer fixed for them in a state that is not associated with sleep, with that's part of the circadian rhythms that mean night and rest and digest, and the vegetative eyes closed brain enters certain modes of functioning that we call sleep. And yet the reality may appear just as fluid, just as liquefied, just as amorphous in a way, as within the dream state, within the context, within the so-called waking context. So it loses its sense of permanence, it loses its fixity to some extent. Or if there is some fixedness to it, it's going to be weird to put it this way. Even that fixity is fluid. It's just a fixture, is an element out of many. It's like, okay, part of the fluidity right now is that this thing is stuck, is stiff, is fixed, but is no longer a defining quality, which is the given for us. Our default relating to our experience is this fixity, is this rigidity, is this constant identifying of patterns and naming and concepts and things like that. Whereas there is just one of the things. There may be some fixity too, but it kind of comes and goes, and it washes out, and it's a lot more fluid. And in the process of waking up, actually, this continuum that you're talking about becomes a lot more, on one sense, continuous across the threshold of these largely divided states of waking, sleeping, and dreaming. It's not just, this is the set spectrum of waking states, and this is the spectrum of dreaming states, and these are the weird liminal spaces and the transitional, chaotic, hypnagogic, and hypnopompic inflection points between cycles of either one or the other. The whole thing becomes a lot more interlinked, and the colors bleed into one another, so to speak, because the locus of identity retracts from the fixity of perception that we identify with further back to where all of a sudden the larger landscape is being perceived. So I'm not there yet to be able to make this statement in all honesty as my dwelling experience, but essentially everything may come across as dreamlike at some point, have an equal quality of unsolidity, of unrealness, of let's say an empty quality. Now we no longer colonize with concepts, with words, with names, that we no longer taint with attempting to communicate, or bastardize by trying to fix it into shapes, to put it into boxes so we can identify and do something with. It remains much like a child's experience, total and undivided in a way. Just pure colors, just pure physical sensations, just pure auditory vibration, sounds, just pure flavors, tastes, and a bunch of other undefined senses that we don't ascribe to the main categories in that sense of orientation and spatial qualities, and what's it like being a bat or a dolphin or a snake. We have a lot more senses than the five usually ascribed in a way. And all of these, they become no longer divided in that state, in that space, because there's no longer a need to carve off slices that get assigned a concept, that gets assigned a name, that gets assigned symbols to represent it on pieces of paper or screens, and become part of how we transfer this knowledge. We're much more immediate. We're not even skin to skin with reality. We're behind the skin. We're within the skin of reality, no longer separate from this.
it's very beautiful to hear you speak this way, because it's one of the first experiences I've had of having the experience of what is being described while it's being described. And I'm not sure why that's happening, but it's happening for me a bit. Ordinarily, my intellect is pervasive, and it's fun. It's skillful. My intellect is skillful. I enjoy it.
I know.
I know.
Yeah.
It's like having a really nice sports car or some kind of acrobatic device or something, right? It has freedom. It has freedom. But this is different. This is like, it's like what we're talking about. I'm gently, lucidly waking right now. While you were speaking, I began to imagine that our waking consciousness often, when we're trapped in it, it often operates like a kind of a fixture or a faucet head, that there's some kind of flow between the appearance of inside and outside, right? There's this sort of strange, they're both emanating from the same thing, right? And they're both dying into the same thing. So they're both like originating at the same thing and then looking at each other and then dying into the same thing at this, this is all happening, right? But in waking consciousness, there's a fixture that dominates this flow and forces it into familiar shapes and functions. You can imagine the difference between a faucet head where there's just like one flow of the water coming out, and a faucet head that splits it into all these little flows, right? I have one actually like this, right? Because it washes things better if there's many little streams. And so it strikes me that waking consciousness is doing something like this. It's splitting into familiar shapes the relational flow between inside, outside, origin, and whatever we want to call the disappearance.
End point, the dissolution point.
I know, but it's something like origin is such a great word, but I don't have the word for this. Maybe it's death. And actually, we might have these back.
What's the opposite of origin, right? What's the antonym?
Yeah, right. Machine. One of the antonyms of origin, it's machine. But it might be that death and origin are the same thing, right? Like there's a circle here, right, behind the scene, and at the top it looks like origin, and we could put them either way, right? I've also recently started wondering whether or not perhaps I've mentioned this before in a couple of videos, but perhaps we're very confused about death, and that all of our motivation and affinity and disaffinity and what we call our intuition and even our dreaming, our desire for another, or our revulsion or disgust for something, all of these are leaking backwards into our life from our death, right? Not from before, as we usually think of. We usually think of like, oh, I got all that stuff previously. I'm just carrying it along with me in this, incarnation. But what if we have that back? What if it's all from after our lives and it's like leaking backward into time, right? And our affinities and desires and motivations and all of these things, they actually come from death, from beyond this life. But see, now we're getting into a whole bunch of other problems, because you were talking earlier about attempting to use the attempt to trace back a linear history in dreaming, right, to achieve lucidity as a method for becoming lucid, right? You find yourself away. If I understood you, did I get that right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And so this is the weird fucking thing about being awake. And my son, he said, which I thought was brilliant and actually kind of blew my mind. He's become a monk, by the way. He's at an ashram in Southern Cal. He said, You know, remember, Dad, how you told me that sometimes in dreams when you have, I actually have a word for when there's a crisis and you have a question. I call it a granch, right? Which is like a three-way branch. It either backfills or, and you keep dreaming, or you wake up, or the gentle intrusion of the waking consciousness comes and you become lucid to some degree, right? So he said, Dad, remember
Yeah.
when you were telling me about how dreams backfill, right? They can just make up any explanation for how you got into a medieval castle being chased by a 3-inch tall pink Tyrannosaurus. And it can be like, yeah, you know, you were playing with dinosaurs 4 days ago, and that one just started, it got really mad at you, and you know, whatever, it just makes shit up. And I was like, yeah. He said,
Hmm.
well, why do you not think that that's the same thing your waking mind is doing? What if it's just so much better at it that how would you know? How would you ever find out if, what if you didn't exist yesterday? What if there is no yesterday? What if you weren't born? What if there's no world,
Yeah.
right? How would you tell,
Mm.
right? And I was like, oh yeah, yeah, that's why me and your mom got together and produced this kind of a kid. So ask this thing.
Mhm.
Yeah, that stuff's crazy. So I think it's really important. Um, You see, we are trained, especially men, and women less so, but they have their own modes. And of course, there's no purely gender syncratic, you know, purely gender idiosyncratic thing. There's no such thing as that. On the other hand, there are tendencies, right, that we might identify. And this is pattern matching. I get it. You know, I'm playing a game here. But we are trained as men. If someone comes to us and says, you know, blah, 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 if we can determine, especially if it's our girlfriend or something, if we can determine immediately that that's not true, what they're saying isn't true, then we just dismiss that shit, just flush the toilet. Right? A lot of us. We're trained to dismiss things that we can immediately determine are not true. And yet, weirdly, most of our capacity for insight and for discovery and for wisdom and for awareness, deepening awareness and waking up, they do not depend on truth. They depend on something like novelty, useful novelty of an as if construct. Right? My son
Yes.
wasn't saying, Dad, you don't exist. You weren't born. You know, there is no yesterday. He's not saying that. He's saying something like,
What if?
how useful
Yes.
might it be for you to entertain that perspective? What could you gain perspectively by playing that way for a moment?
This can get things very complicated and very tricky, and we can get lost in a maze of mirrors when it comes to this, because essentially the discourse on that level, that's why when you brought the question up earlier, I thought, well, that is brilliant, because you know that's a dynamite question. It's one of those razor questions that if you wear it close and use it consistently, this is more, powerful than Occam's razor for one who's on the path. Like, what would it mean to ask yourself that question to the point of obsessiveness, to sow such a deep distrust of your own perceptual capacities, mental processes, to challenge everything you believe, everything you see, everything you hear, the way the information and knowledge is organized in your head, and do that continuously, or maybe if not continuously, steadily, regularly enough, often to begin with, seldom, but then we're not used to up to maintaining this level of effort. And then more often, with a degree of regularity, more regularity, with some stretches of continuity, more continuity, to where this becomes a continuous process where everything is being hammered by this under layer of essentially distrust. I'm going to use the word distrust because it's stronger than the one I'm going to use now, which is one of the three pillars of Zen. They speak of great faith, great doubt, and great determination. You know, the faith is really what keeps me going in the end. The determination is the actual keeping going, is the continuity I was speaking about. And the what of the keeping going is this constant scissoring and razoring with this doubt, with this distrust. What's it really like? What's it really like? What's it really like? Now, the moment this remains an as if, instead of it becoming an existential question, if we relate to it as an epistemological question, what if? This becomes, in a way, it risks becoming another mental scenario. You know, being in the matrix, in a simulation of a matrix, that in that simulation there exists a simulation of the matrix, and so on. And this can go on forever. Now there's some fantastic both series and Black Mirror episodes there that play on this theme that can leave one feeling quite disturbed over this incapacity to ascertain what's it really like. You know, when waking up for a dream and this dream is, wow, realizing that this is a dream, and then waking up from this and this is a dream. Yeah, so if we get lost in the as if, the same mind remains in control that is used to operating with these fixed logical categories that is entrenched in our mode of operating. If we switch this to become a more existential question, an ontological question, not an epistemological one, all of a sudden the dreaming body gets involved, because we're going to have to cut through the noise and the turning gears and the whirrings of the mechanisms of the as if scenario building mental mind, and resort to different faculties, because we can no longer trust the mental faculties. So how would I know? How can I find out? And that how, this is not a rhetorical question. It's like, fuck, if this is so, let's say we're in a simulation. How the fuck would I even know that?
Right.
How do I find out?
Yeah,
where do I go? You know, the wallpaper's peeling off and I can see the characters like in the Matrix, you know, scrolling neon green kind of thing. Where do I go? What do I do? What do I engage in? And that, allowing that acid to seep in, begins to produce some changes in the way we live, in the way we perceive, the way we think, and everything else. Not the contents, not the actual answers, not the playing with the as if, and, you know, aliens, and whether this is simulation or matrix or dream or the Plato's cave or the play, as some have it, but the question itself. What's it really like? What if this is not it either? How do I find out? How do I find out? And have that become the baseline of operation. It can, you know, dissolve the mind, or it can break the mind. Not all people make it in this process. You know, not, I think the seeking ratio of those who actually venture far enough to achieve escape velocity and call it whatever you want, wake up, become enlightened, whatever these, you know, pat phrases that we use with so much nonchalance. I think the rate is this small. Up past a certain point, there's severe obstacles and challenges to our functioning, which can very easily amount to a mental breakdown, a psycho-emotional crash, energetic malfunctioning, disease. Shamanic disease is part of it, or even death in some cases. Schizophrenia, not uncommon.
Brilliant. Yes. All right. So I want to say back to you what I took from some of what you said there. You know, I can often see a position far ahead of what I am capable, what I feel that I'm capable or seem to be capable of actually enacting or embodying. So in a way, I'm a bit like a perspectival science fiction author, right? I, I'm, I
Mm-hmm.
create scenarios, right? And I can see far ahead, in a sense, what seems to be ahead. Maybe it's just my head. Um,
You can see ahead, far ahead. That's good. That's good.
exactly. But I'm not sure I tend to enact them, embody them. And you're talking about a situation where someone could become very fascinated by these as if worlds. And of course, one of the examples of
Yeah.
insight that has nothing to do with what is true, per se, is the entire oeuvre of science fiction. Right? It's not there to tell you what is true. It's there to give you perspectives and
Right.
extrapolations that are profoundly useful and change your capacity to have ideas, right? And to think about what it means or could mean to be human or a being
Yeah.
or a machine or a world or time space or all of these things, right? So it's
Yeah.
very rich, and was my primary means of education was just hundreds, if not thousands, of science fiction stories. Um, but my point is, what you're talking about is there's a difference between having a garden of interesting little perspectival mirrors and actually getting in the fucking water and becoming a boat. Like you can have 100 different dreams of boats, right? And that's not this, and those dreams of boats can reflect off of each other and they can be fun or insane or terrifying or boring or whatever it can be. But that's a totally different thing from becoming a boat and actually,
Yeah.
on the water, being in the water of the nature of origin, of awareness, of consciousness, of dreaming, of waking, of intellect, of being, right? And having this vehicle in which you're actually doing the being of the process of shedding the layers of delusion, illusion, formal representational cognition, human cultural ideas, categories, identity and language versus identity and relation versus identity and origin or being. If you're actually trying to cut through the many veils of Maya or delusion or illusion or self-deception or broken cognition, that's also dangerous and can result in bad problems. Right? It's not just like, well, if you actually do it, you're better off.
It's not only dangerous, it's one, ineffective, and two, at the end of the day, it's impossible, for a reason which might sound simple expressed in words, but again, until you become that boat you're talking about and have this experientially, uh, it will not have its full measure of impact,
Mm.
which is that it cannot cut across veils and layers of veils for the simple reason that they actually do not exist. And the cutting across is actually what is endowing them with a solidity that they do not themselves
Oh
possess.
my God. Okay, you're not supposed to say that.
Won't make any difference for most people. Won't make any difference. It will remain an as if, or except for a few, for whom it will be more than just an as if. What you're talking about earlier about the becoming a boat, and thousands of books of science fiction, which if they do their work right, they get us to beyond imagine alternative scenarios and futures and possibilities. They make us question. They make us wonder. The point is not to consume endlessly science fiction, but to use that as a sort of nutrient, as a
Mm.
fertilizer that plays a number on the mind, that allows it to soften up its categories, to become more fluid, to open up horizons, to relax back into that dreaming body where this creativity stemmed from in the first place.
Mhm.
Um, So the point is not the endless contents and the thousands of science fiction books, which is the myriad plethora of, you know, illusion in that sense
Yeah.
of the, you know, illusionist's act.
The what if story.
As much as, exactly, the what if stories. But to turn backwards, much like your friend was telling you, towards where the guy you interviewed,
Sergio
I
McGowan.
guess,
Yeah.
to turn backwards to context, to switch from contents to context. What is the context of all of this? What is an awareness? Is that context? But that's still just a word. What is the awareness itself? So to constantly do this turning, it's a weird way to put it this way, but it really feels like this even in the body, to constantly turn it back, inwards and backwards, to look at the, to use your word, origin of this. That amounts in this multitude of impressions, sensations, books, knowledge, talks, exchanges, life experiences, seeming linearity or fluidity or whatnot. What's the origin point? Which is also the point of this solution in a way, because it's beyond the time-space, time frame in that regard. So to constantly turn back, turn back, turn back, turn inwards and backwards, even while engaging with all of these things. I'm not advocating, you know, close your eyes and go into navel gazing mode. For a while, for many people, this may need to be part of the practice, because we lack the practice to settle and turn in and back. Initially, this may need to be a necessary step. It's actually an advanced step, which I discourage people from learning or teaching anytime soon. And I think there's great disfavor that has been done to meditation by being taught so openly and early in the game to a bunch of people who, for the most part, are not suited for it. We need many other layers before arriving at meditation, but it amounts to this, like turning inwards and backwards, and then being able to maintain this inwards and backwards, even as we move, interact, sleep, cook, eat, piss, fuck, you know, present projects, talk on stage, die, you know, ride a motorcycle or sail a boat, and still inwards, turn inwards and backwards, and not get lost in the contents. The contents is fascinating. And the show steals us. When the attention gets drawn out into this, and we forget. And this is part of the spell that has us be zombies and in a trance, because we forget. We get drawn out into this fascinating, we get suckered into this fascinating show.
Well, it's this thing, again, that I only had this vision kind of for the first time today. So first of all, everything you're saying, like, this is so valuable. I feel like a kid who found a bank door open in the middle of the night, and he walks into the bank, there's nobody in there, and the alarm's off, and the vault is wide open. And the treasure's just sitting there like glowing. I mean, that's how I'm feeling right now. This is not what I was expecting, which is also refreshing. Although I didn't necessarily have highly organized expectations. So I'm reminded again of this fixture, that this faucet that is structuring the flow of the relationship between what I get that these are these are terms of convenience. They're not real. The structuring the flow between context and perceiver or being, right? Environment and one in the environment. Structuring that flow, but it's also structuring the flow between origin and death, or whatever the opposite of origin is. And if you get an inspiration about that, I'd love to hear.
It's not really an opposite. I wanted to offer you, we're still in the realm of allegories and illustrations and so on, but the shape that you're trying to describe, it's putting these points apart at the distance. And I'll offer a different alternative, where actually these two are not even just convergent, they're actually identical. And the shape is a torus, where what emerges, you know, and it spreads out, it fans out, and then it reaches a point of maximum expansion, as it were, and then it kind of converges. And this is both a linear and a nonlinear process. This actually happens all the time, you know, and this expansion phase is what we call origin, yes? And this contraction phase, the crunch, the whatever you want to call it, is what you call death, right?
Well, in a
And they're
way,
the same.
sure, that's very sensible. And I appreciate the like it doesn't even have to be a torus, right? It could be this. Right? It can be coming out of here and going into the structure, right? The faces, right? And then it disappears somewhere down here. There's a center point here. Then it rises up this side and goes back into the invisibleness, right? Doesn't necessarily have to be a torus. This by itself is an interesting toy of it, or could be made useful. But I mean, I'm not reading from the book of Darren right now. I'm trying actually to see better, which when I'm at my best is what I'm up to. Maybe the opposite of origin is the delusion of known identities, functions, forms, situations, and relationships. Maybe that's what I mean by the opposite of origin. Because when I think of origin, I don't necessarily mean merely where things come from. I mean the clear seeing that arises in relation as origin. Excuse me. So, like, in a sense, clear seeing and origin are the same thing, and deluded, sort of zombieist waking mind, oh, I know what's going on, is kind of the opposite. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
It maps one of the traditions that has some of this best mapped of what I've encountered is Tibetan Buddhism. It's Vajrayana. And essentially what you've described there translates in their jargon as the definition of nirvana and samsara.
Yeah.
So you have the clear seeing awareness that has no divisions and is essentially undividing. And then you have the multitude of forms, and moreover, not even just the forms, but the identification with forms, and the impression of separateness, and the isolation of this and that, of self and others, of I and thou and everything else, which is what makes up the samsaric world. They're essentially undivided. They cannot be otherwise, but they express in these two forms, as it were. And one is the ever-present origin, to use a phrase that is not mine.
Gebser, yeah, Gene Gebser.
That's right. That is constantly there. Is the center that is everywhere, as Black Elk used to say. Yes. And the other one is the identification of objects with objects, of self with self and others, and the deludedness, not the illusion, you know, not just the game of forms known as a game of forms, but the deludedness of these being having value, meaning, importance, of consisting of something. There's a difference here between delusion and illusion. The illusion is believing it, as it were, believing it for real.
Right.
Whereas in illusion, we can be with it and just enjoy the show, knowing it is illusory, knowing it is empty, you know, knowing that these are just contents on the formless context in that regards, and seeing it for what it is, illusory.
So again, I'm going to come back to this this device, this appliance that structures waking consciousness and does the thing my son was talking about of assuring us of the knowable continuity and categorical identity of things, beings, situations, relationships, histories, all these things, right? Imagine that there's like a little, like the kind of a thing that structures water on the end of a hose, right? And it's splitting the water into these parts that we were taught to split this way as children in language and category and so forth, right? But it does something else. It does something really weird. You know how water, when it sprays out of a hose in the sunlight, there's all these lighting effects, like there's rainbows and it's iridescent and the water is shining and sparkling. Or even if you just look, for example, at the ocean at sunset, right? You'll see this coruscating layer of light on the surface of it that's very enchanting and powerful, I think, and is actually mystically profound in my view. This nozzle, it takes away the real light, the actual effect of the illumination, and it puts something dead there. It kills the living light that would naturally arise from the relationship between interior and context, right? As these two things are relating. On the two sides of the torus, for example, right? There's this light that is the sort of hallmark or effect of their interaction. And of course, we can say there is no interaction, they're the same thing. Yes, yes, of course, I get it. But this faucet head, it makes fake light. It takes the living light of awareness and relation away. It sort of hides that shit by producing all these artifacts. And you can see this in human behavior with representations, especially at the social or cultural level. They just make dead light all the time. And the dead light is brighter than the living light. I mean, it's fucking serious. Photographs, videos, and, you know, ideological declarations, all these things that the humans make. It's like a kind of dead light, but it's very compelling. And part of why it can be compelling is because there are features of representational cognition, which I'm thinking of as this faucet head, sort of, right? That's structuring the flow that would otherwise be very amazing and diversely sophisticated and beautiful. It would dance. It would be musical. It's killing all that down into manipulable structure, manipulable with the dead inside aspect of what we could think of as the left hemisphere. It's a grave oversimplification. Let's call it pseudo left hemispheric style, right? Like it wants dead shit it can grasp and manipulate and count and analyze and is predictable and so forth, because that reduces vigilance by reducing ambiguity and making prediction very simple. Let's be very clear. If you're concerned about having accurate predictions, the best thing you can do is kill everything. If everything's dead, your prediction's going to be fucking amazing every time. You're going to be right every time you do a prediction. Right? Just kill that shit.
Right.
And now you got perfect predictability, which makes you look like a god. Because now you can accurately predict. The more you can accurately predict the future, the more enlightened you must be. Right? You've escaped the mystery of time just by killing everything. Right? So there's these really huge problems in human collective cognition as moderns, right? There's all these weird little features. I named, you know, this triumvirate of vigilance, ambiguity, and prediction. Anytime you can reduce ambiguity, you reduce the vigilance burden. All animals want a lesser vigilance burden. And anything human, since we can actually manipulate the environment, this is why we live in dead inside houses, right? Look around me. There's one thing moving here, me. All that other stuff is dead. I don't have to worry about that. It's not going anywhere, right? The wall's not going to start, like a hand's not going to come out of the wall and I'm going to have to, you know, determine what's going on. It's not going to happen. This stuff is dead. I don't have to worry about it. There's no ambiguity, right? The only ambiguity is like, can I pay the rent? Is the landlord coming over? Does the electricity work? You know, where's the food going to come in from? But that's the ambiguity. So I'm blathering on a little bit, but I want to actually return to a topic we've explored, I think, very fruitfully and brilliantly, which is as a student of Zen for a long time, and I'm not making any kind of claim about I'm making the opposite of a claim that I'm an experienced Zen person or something. I've been sitting Zazen for a long time, and I go through phases where I sit some and then not so much. Um, so I'm just trying to say I'm not an expert, but I mean, I would call myself a novice after 40 years. In any case, trying to understand okay, yeah, now we're going to get into a huge problem. So I made a whole recording with some friends on the problem of what. Like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Well, it turns out that one hand clapping, if you could hear it, literally might sound like what? What? Now, this is an intellectual spin, right? But it's also, even that intellectual spin is useful because it's also that trying to figure out what is going on or what that is or what is, what is what is mu. A lot of these questions start with what, and it strikes me very, you know, this is also one hand clapping, right? It strikes me that this what is actually a huge problem because we don't want to figure out what something is or what is going on.
Well, it's only a huge problem if we attempt to answer it the way it's sound stopped. Can still hear me okay?
Yeah, the way it's
It was
you're breaking up.
okay. Signal's a bit weird. Let me check.
Yeah, you're breaking up.
Should be all right. So this what only becomes a problem. You see, this is one of the issues with taking a practice style out of its context that it grew up in and without the full understanding of how it is to be applied. Fundamentally, on some level, the whole bushy plethora of varietals of koans and equivalents there, and the whats and whos and hows are really just personal aesthetic or functional choices of the teacher and the student and the teacher student combo to essentially inject that what or who as a question in the practice. A Zen practice fundamentally, it's reduced to just sitting without containing this element of what I mentioned earlier, suspicion, the doubt, and the undermining of our thinking and perceptual structures, will amount to little more than just glorified vegetating on some level. And then people will think they're doing Zen or they're doing Zazen.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, what needs to happen there at the same time is this drilling, but not as a mental process, but as this backwards and inwards looking of what is this? Who is having this experience? What is this experience? What is the nature of what I call reality? What is this awareness? All of these amount to nothing in intellectual terms, and the point is actually not to answer these questions. The moment we actually give an answer to that what, we've completely missed the point. We've taken that what in the wrong direction, taken it seriously, as it were, in the wrong way, and answered it on its level. That's actually a method for self-destruction, if we can put it this way. It's meant to lead to that dissolution of the very mind that's even asking that question in the first place. Who's having this?
Mm.
Who's seeing? Who's hearing? Who's sitting here? Who's asking these questions? Who's thinking these thoughts? What is this awareness that's present constantly? You know, these are words. There's a faculty saying these words. I'm witnessing it. Clearly, I'm not it, or I wouldn't be able to witness it any more than an eye can see itself. Then what is witnessing it? It's not these words themselves. The what is behind the what. And the point is to return to that nameless origin that is behind the what, that is behind the who, and that's the essence or the intent of these, to be used as arrows, to be used as daggers, if you will. If you get caught in the game of answering them, we've lost.
Yes. Yes, this is what you now every time I use the word what, I'm going to laugh. What you've just been sharing about is fundamentally crucial to the pursuit of awakening, because an intellectual approach to koans is almost the exact opposite of the purpose of engaging them, and could be deadly to awakening, possibly even to humans, because it can result in a kind of, it's the same thing we were talking about a moment ago. The left hemisphere-like aspect of awareness, it wants dead manipulables. So it gets really interested in the question of what is mu. And it feels like I can figure that out, right? And so effectively what happens is you're building a skyscraper where you want a forest or you know, a flowing stream or something, right? You want the pure organic thing, not the construct. You know, it occurred to me in a conversation with a close friend some time ago for the first time, as somebody who sat with Mu for a long time, that intellectually one could understand Chao Chu saying Mu, you know, when asked, does even this dog have Buddha nature? It says Mu, which essentially means no. He's certainly not saying no. And it occurred to me again intellectually, and I'm doing the
He's both saying and he's both saying and not saying no. There's an issue, as I said, with taking these out of context, that we flatten them.
Yeah.
On some level, and I'm going to be a bit let's say overly firm maybe in saying, or overly strict in saying what I'm about to say.
Good.
But doing these things outside the supervision of someone who is very, I'm not going to say knowledgeable, but experienced of these, and ideally, at least in the tradition and context of Zen, which doesn't dick around with stuff. Zen is not keen on building structures and explanations, you know, and explanatory scaffolding. Zen is basically a bunch of demolition guys gone haywire. Yes.
Yeah.
And in the Zen, there's only one touchstones, and that's realization. Does someone have realization? And Zen is based on realization and on the validation of realization, and this cannot be transmitted, but it can be verified. So unless you work in the context of someone who is a supervisor, who has experiential understanding of this, again, I'm avoiding knowledgeable because it's not about knowledge, experiential understanding of it. It's actually more about embodiment, back to our dreaming body, than about knowledge and the mind, and ideally realization. Otherwise, it's the blind leading the blind, or eventually the one-eyed man leading the blind, or the almost blind ones, and so on. So that's why these things get really lost the moment they're trapped in books, and people read the books and they read them with the same entrapping mind that splits like your faucet, the jets in a specific shape and all of that. And the Zen just gets flushed out with all the rest in the process.
Oh,
And you're
beautiful.
losing a marvelous opportunity.
Yeah. Oh,
That might have been much better if you'd never read any Zen books in the first place.
yeah.
Just go meet your teacher, clueless about what Zen is.
Yeah.
But meet a teacher.
Yeah. Yeah.
Meet a roshi.
Yeah. It's good. Everything you say. I trust it. I appreciate the severity. It is authentically from the Zen tradition, this severity. And it's true what you say. I thought of something while you were speaking that is interesting, and I want to also return to the other, um, the dreaming body. You know, we have these tropes in English, the one-eyed man leading the blind and so forth, and blah, 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 right? But the actual problem we're facing is way worse than that. Way worse. That's a shitty trope. Because the problem that we're facing is that a man with one fake eye is leading people who have actual eyes, and neither of them can see, right? So there's like a phony eye. This is this like our whole discussion orbits this one thing, right? We're seeing our waking experience with a phony, with like two different phony eyes. And they have absolute authority in our common experience and among our peers. They actually believe everything these fake eyes tell them, pretty much, right? And they're very confused about the difference between what the fake eyes tell them and their interiority and their feelings and their experiences and their emotions, and all kinds of psychological fucking labyrinths, right, result from the fake eyes that tell us what's going on, who that is, I'm fucking this guy, that's what's supposed to happen, blah, blah, blah. All these fake eyes, which have a lot to do with representational cognition and a lot to do with enculturation in what I would call fictional collectives. These are not actual collectives of humans. These are like processes that have captured humans and produce shit like what's going on in the Ukraine or the Middle East or fucking Walmart, right? Whatever you want to pick, right? So yeah, I just want to say, like, the one-eyed man leading the blind would be amazing compared to what we're going through. Because what we're going through is a fucking nightmare made up of bullshit that just gets further entrenched and made more explicit and more common among people and more confusing generation after generation after generation. You know, I've heard people say,
Yeah.
it's a fucking nightmare. Like, I've heard people saying shit like, oh, you know, the humans take heart. They're about to wake up. This is the great awakening of the human. No, I don't think so.
Right.
I'm not seeing anything that even slight resembles that. That's actually the fake eyes talking, right? So, yeah, I just want to clarify that trope, because actual blind people, fuck, I want to be led by an actual blind person. They're not deceived by the fucking fake eyes, right? At least they're actually probably fucking sensing with their body what's going on.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, they're way more sensitive than us, colonized by the visual sense. When it comes to that, actually, you can almost trust more a blind person. It's great to spot the weakness of that trope, and yeah, it would be an easy situation if it's just a matter of blind leading the blind. We'd know what we have to work on, right?
Not only that,
whereas in what you're describing, it's much harder to work our way out of the labyrinth.
Yeah.
What you're talking about, and I'll make for a nice segue for another time. We're coming up against our couple of hours here, actually. What you're talking about is essentially 1984.
Yes.
The issue at stake is we're living in 1984. This is no longer in the future. Is no longer a possibility. This is the double speak. This is the fake eye imposing a reality, and the eye that can see but does not believe what it's seeing because of the fake eye. This is the confusion. This is the default to authority. This is the subjection to fear, and the absorbing of those standards of fake seeing as being true seeing in the very presence of true seeing, and all of this. And the issue is that this is what is happening right now. And this is not something we're going to be contending with. 1984 and Black Mirror were premonitory materials, but they're actually realistic prose and filmmaking when it comes to our current situation. And because too few people take that seriously enough, we're hung in that space.
It's not necessarily that too few people take it seriously. There's something weirder going on, which is that I was writing about this yesterday, and see what you think about this. Feel free to push back if this doesn't fit, with what you see. And also, yeah, we definitely have to do this again because I want another couple hours with you.
There's more material. Yeah. There's more material, yeah.
But okay, the problem is, in a sense, that this goes with my concept of thrisps, right? They are structured echoes in the network of human minds that act like organisms competing for dominance, which actual organisms, I don't think they do that, but these things do. And I'm not going to go into a long lecture about that. What I'm going to say is these are like processes that capture humans to enact and preserve them in the cognitive and behavioral layer of human existence, right? And the thing about it is that the dead inside processes and the people that are captured by those, the better they are captured, the more capable they are of organizing. And the less people are captured, the less capable they seem to be of organizing. We have no way, there's not a common method that we are familiar with to create little collectives that can do things. We're pretty good at talking about stuff. We can get together and talk about things. But generally, we very rarely, and this is one of the things I like about you, I know that you occasionally, at least occasionally, you get a group of people together and you do some work together, right? And I think that's amazing, and I honor and respect that. What I'm trying to say is sort of the dark side of the Force, really good at organizing. The Jedi, they suck at organizing shit. They're like these lone wolves, tumbling around, falling down a mountainside, trying to keep the lightsaber still working. And they don't get together and form a collective that could. I'm not saying that they have to attack the dark side either. I think one of the things we could do is just go on missions that are beautiful together, right? Like fucking solve an actual problem in someone's life or the world or a situation together as a team. That would be amazing if we could just do that. Apparently we can forge sports teams and military intelligence units and shit like there's no tomorrow. But we're not really forming teams to retrieve and enact our humanity and its urgent originary potencies.
In our culture, in our current form of civilization and our culture on no recognizable scale, because such, I will call them imaginal cells in terms of small collectives like this exist. The thing you're pointing out is a much larger conversation, which we're not going to broach here, but it's actually more of an elemental dynamic of forces between the generative expansiveness, which essentially just blows up constantly new shapes, much like dreaming does, as it were, and a different kind of force, which is more about coalescing, cooling things down. One is more like a stellar emission and ejection process, and stars don't build shit at the end of the day, right? They may have spontaneous patterning that occurs, but mostly they just burn stuff up, and there's that generativeness. Now, at the same time, everything is essentially facilitated by starlight, by heat. We owe life to star heat, right? Like our sun, to stellar equivalent processes like fire within us, for that matter, and so on and so forth. Yes, and then there's the cooling forces that hold it together. Our own Earth would not hold together if it hadn't cooled down from the stellar matter stuff that it was before.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we take these things personally, we will start seeing these as, you know, liberals and conservatives and stuff like that. But it's really far more elemental. Though what you're talking about there is at a different level in the organizational sense, and you know how certain processes we tend to default to heavy. What you're describing is actually a sort of defaulting to heavy because of how our culture is oriented, and this is a topic for yet another time. We're living a death phobic culture that is actually death oriented, and that is this constant contraction mode that you're talking about, and allowing these parasite processes that have taken over humans in that sense to organize in ways in which what you're essentially describing is cancer.
Yeah.
As opposed to the bustle of a living organism and so on, which doesn't proliferate randomly, right? It's not going to be like the guys sliding down, you know, mountainsides like you're describing, yes, but they're not going to, you know, create large congregation and want to take up more space and organize past their point. A liver will not outlive its role. The heart will play its own function. You know, a white cell won't get curious about what red cells do, you know, or get white cells together so they can form an alternate liver, because fuck this shit if we're gonna deal with these guys anymore. You know, they kind of play their role and they get generated and reabsorbed and generated and reabsorbed. And cancer, on the other hand, it's about unity. It's about homogenizing. It's about growth without limits, and taken over, and a sort of unhealthy equality, so to speak, in that regard.
Yes.
As opposed to the, you know, fertile, creative, organized chaos of everything else that is a living organism that
Yeah,
has
I
all
mean,
these
organ,
discrepancies.
right? Organized
Yeah.
means the preservation of distinct elements in relation, right? It doesn't one
Yes.
organ, you know. I agree.
Yes.
That's brilliant. Yeah, everything you said makes perfect sense. So grateful. What a privilege. I actually feel like we weren't merely talking about things, but I mean, I was having some direct experiences of what we were talking about, and I just treasure your way in the world and your path and the privilege of sharing some of that together. Yeah, really appreciate you.
Thanks for inviting this, Darren. Thanks for this opportunity. And yes, maybe the ripples of this will reverberate past our little spark of a cell here in the exchange we've had. And yeah, we'll let this ripple in our own lives and see what this brings up and what we get to dream about.
Yes.
Onwards and further.
All right, my friend. More soon, I hope. Again, sometime soon.
Yes, thank you. Be well and keep in touch. Stay in the body.
I'd like to. You too. Peace for now.
Till soon. Bye, Darren.
Bye,
Bye, everyone.
Andre. Bye, everybody.